Story 1. By Mike Delfino. It was a cool autumn weekend when my friends and I decided to embark on a camping trip deep within the heart of the Blackwood Forest. We were seasoned campers, seeking adventure far away from the comforts of civilization. Little did we know that this trip would become a spine-chilling encounter with the supernatural, leaving us questioning the boundaries of reality and the existence of things beyond our comprehension. We arrived at the forest on a Friday afternoon, our excitement palpable as we set up our campsite near the banks of a tranquil, moonlit lake. The towering trees cast eerie shadows, their branches swaying in the gentle breeze. As night fell, the forest came alive with the symphony of nocturnal creatures. Our group consisted of 4 friends: Mike, Sarah, Mark, and myself, John. We shared ghost stories around the campfire, the flames dancing wildly as we tried to outdo each other with tales of the paranormal. Little did we know that the Blackwood Forest had stories of its own to tell. The first sign that something was amiss came on the second night. We were sitting around the campfire, sipping hot cocoa and exchanging jokes when a rustling sound emerged from the depths of the forest. We all fell silent, straining our ears to discern the source of the noise. Mike, ever the brave one, grabbed a flashlight and declared, "I'll check it out." With that, he disappeared into the inky blackness, his footsteps echoing through the trees. Minutes felt like hours as we waited for Mike to return. Anxiety gnawed at our hearts. Sarah clutched my arm tightly, her eyes wide with fear. Just as we were about to call out to him, Mike reappeared, his face pale as a sheet. "I saw something," he stammered, his voice trembling. It was a figure, lurking in the shadows. It didn't look human. We laughed nervously, attributing Mike's experience to the overactive imagination that often accompanies a campfire setting. However, deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted in our minds. Over the next few days, the forest seemed to change. The once tranquil lake turned murky, and the trees whispered ominous secrets in the wind. We discovered strange symbols etched into the bark of the trees, symbols that none of us could decipher. As we explored deeper into the woods, a sense of unease settled upon us like a shroud. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we heard the rustling again. This time, it was accompanied by an eerie, otherworldly chant. The words were incomprehensible, a cacophony of voices that seemed to emanate from all around us. Mark, ever the skeptic, decided to investigate. He ventured deeper into the forest, the chant growing louder with each step. The rest of us huddled together, our hearts pounding in unison. Minutes turned into hours, and Mark did not return. Panic set in as we called out his name, but there was no response. As the hours passed, our fear turned to dread. We knew we had to find Mark. We armed ourselves with flashlights and set out on a desperate search through the forest, following the eerie chant that seemed to lead us deeper into its heart. The trees closed in around us, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the moon and stars. The chant grew louder, resonating through our very souls. It was then that we saw it, a flickering light in the distance, illuminating a clearing in the forest. As we approached the clearing, our breath caught in our throats. Mark stood at the center, surrounded by the figures of shadowy, ethereal beings. They chanted in a language that sent shivers down our spines. Mark's eyes were vacant, his body swaying in rhythm with the chant. We called out to him, but he did not respond. It was as if he were in a trance, ensnared by some unseen force. With mounting dread, we realized that the figures were not alone. A towering, grotesque creature stood among them, its eyes burning like embers. In that moment, we knew we were in the presence of something beyond our comprehension, something ancient and malevolent. Fear gripped us, but we could not tear our eyes away from the surreal spectacle unfolding before us. As the chant reached its crescendo, the ground beneath us trembled, and the very air seemed to vibrate with energy. Suddenly, the figures and Mark disappeared in a blinding flash of light. The clearing was empty, as if nothing had ever happened. We stumbled back to our campsite, our minds reeling from the inexplicable encounter. Mark was gone, and we were left with no answers, only haunting questions. We packed up our gear and left the Blackwood Forest that very night, our hearts heavy with the weight of the unknown. To this day, we have never been able to explain what happened in those woods. Mark was never found, and the memories of that fateful camping trip continue to haunt our dreams. The Blackwood Forest holds its secrets tightly, and we are left to wonder if we had unwittingly crossed the threshold into a realm of the supernatural, where the line between reality and the unexplainable blurs into an eternal enigma. Story 2. By Sarah Treverson. The cold night air pressed against my face as I zipped up my sleeping bag, cocooning myself in a flimsy attempt at warmth. The crackling campfire danced in the distance, its faint glow casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. My friends and I had decided to embark on a weekend camping trip deep within the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, seeking adventure and escape from our mundane lives. As we sat around the campfire earlier that evening, swapping stories and roasting marshmallows, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The forest was eerily silent, the only sounds being the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant rustle of leaves. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the night wore on, the stories grew darker. My friend Andre began recounting a local legend about a ghostly figure that supposedly haunted these woods. They called it the Shadow Walker, a spectral entity that was said to appear on moonless nights, luring unsuspecting campers deeper into the forest, never to be seen again. I chuckled nervously, dismissing it as a mere superstition. After all, I was a firm believer in science and reason, not some spine-tingling ghost story. Little did I know that the events that would transpire that night would test the boundaries of my skepticism. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night and retreat to our respective tents. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting an eerie red glow on the trees that surrounded us. I crawled into my sleeping bag and attempted to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled in my gut. Just as I began to drift into a fitful slumber, a noise jolted me awake. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike any animal I had ever heard. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, my ears picking up the faintest rustle of leaves. I unzipped my tent just enough to peer outside, my flashlight clenched tightly in my trembling hand. The beam of light swept over the nearby trees, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. I reasoned it could be a bear or some other wildlife, though the growl had sounded eerily human. I whispered to my friends, waking them up one by one. Andre, always the skeptic, rolled his eyes and dismissed it as a raccoon or a fox. However, Sarah, our resident nature enthusiast, looked genuinely concerned. She suggested we stay quiet and listen, hoping to identify the source of the unsettling sound. As we strained our ears, the growl echoed through the woods again, closer this time. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as the realization dawned upon me: this was no ordinary animal. The growl was accompanied by a sinister whisper, like a faint, unintelligible voice carried on the wind. Panic began to spread through the group as we debated what to do. Andre, ever the brave soul, suggested we investigate, convinced it was some prankster trying to scare us. Armed with flashlights and a sense of bravado, we cautiously crept toward the source of the sound. The forest seemed to close in around us as we moved deeper into the darkness. The air grew colder, and a pervasive feeling of dread settled upon us like a shroud. Every rustle of leaves or snapping twig sent shivers down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, our flashlights caught something in the distance, a figure, tall and shadowy, standing among the trees. My heart leaped into my throat as I focused my light on it, revealing a gaunt face, its eyes empty voids of darkness. It was the Shadow Walker. Fear surged through my veins as we all froze in place, unable to comprehend the surreal sight before us. The growls grew louder, now accompanied by a guttural chant that seemed to emanate from the creature's very being. The words were incomprehensible, ancient, and ominous. Without warning, the Shadow Walker began to glide toward us, moving effortlessly through the trees, defying the laws of nature. Panic set in, and we turned and ran as fast as our trembling legs could carry us, our flashlights cutting through the darkness like beacons of hope. But the Shadow Walker was relentless, its malevolent presence closing in on us with each passing second. We zigzagged through the forest, our breaths ragged, our hearts pounding in our chests. I could hear the whispers growing louder, the words now taking on a sinister, mocking tone. Just when it seemed we couldn't run any longer, we stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin, hidden deep within the woods. Desperation fueled our actions as we pushed our way inside, slamming the door shut and barricading it with a heavy wooden beam. Inside, the air was stifling, and the walls were adorned with strange symbols and crude drawings. It felt like a place untouched by time, a relic of a bygone era. We huddled together, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, as the cabin seemed to groan and creak in protest. For hours, we listened as the Shadow Walker prowled outside, its growls and chants growing louder and more frenzied. It was as if it was taunting us, toying with its prey before the final strike. I clutched a pocket knife in my trembling hand, feeling utterly defenseless against the malevolent force that sought to consume us. As dawn broke, the chanting and growling finally ceased. We waited in terrified silence, unsure if the creature had left or if it was merely biding its time. After what felt like an eternity, we mustered the courage to venture outside. The forest was still, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. There was no sign of the Shadow Walker, and the sense of dread that had hung over us like a shroud had lifted. We made our way back to our campsite, packed up our gear in a frenzy, and hiked back to civilization in record time. To this day, I struggle to make sense of that night. The rational part of me wants to dismiss it as a shared hallucination, a product of fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I know what I saw and heard was real. The legend of the Shadow Walker is no longer just a superstition, it's a chilling reality that haunts my dreams. I've since sworn off camping in the Appalachian Mountains, preferring the safety and comfort of city life. But I can't escape the nagging feeling that the Shadow Walker still lingers in those ancient woods, waiting for its next victim, its sinister whispers echoing through the darkness, forever haunting the brave or foolish souls who dare to venture into its domain. Story 3. By Carl Peterson. The invitation to the camping trip came unexpectedly. A close friend of mine, Alex, called me out of the blue, his voice filled with excitement. "Hey, remember that old camping spot we used to talk about in high school?" he asked. "I found it on a map, and I think it's time we actually go." I hadn't thought about that spot in years. It was a remote wilderness area deep within the Rocky Mountains, known for its stunning scenery and untouched beauty. In our youth, we had romanticized the idea of venturing there, but life had gotten in the way, and we'd never actually made the trip. The prospect of reconnecting with nature and revisiting the dreams of our youth was too enticing to resist. We quickly gathered a small group of friends and made plans for a weekend camping trip. As the weekend approached, I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. We had researched the area extensively, but the thought of being so far removed from civilization still gave me a sense of unease. The hike into the wilderness was an arduous one, and we had to carry everything we needed on our backs. The forecast predicted clear skies, but in the mountains, the weather could change in an instant. We set off early on a Friday morning, our backpacks filled with tents, sleeping bags, food, and enough supplies to last us the weekend. The initial part of the hike was relatively easy, following a well-marked trail. We laughed and talked as we walked, reminiscing about old times and sharing stories from our lives. The sun was high in the sky, and the weather was perfect. As we ventured deeper into the wilderness, the trail became less defined, and the forest closed in around us. Tall trees stretched towards the sky, their branches forming a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight. The air was crisp and clean, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was a stark contrast to the city life we had grown accustomed to. As the day wore on, we began to feel the weight of our backpacks, and the conversation grew quieter. We knew that our destination was still a few miles away, and the rugged terrain was taking its toll. The excitement from earlier started to wane, replaced by a sense of exhaustion and vulnerability. By late afternoon, we reached a small clearing next to a pristine mountain stream. It was an ideal spot to set up camp for the night. We pitched our tents, collected firewood, and prepared a simple meal. The mood lightened as we sat around the campfire, the flames flickering in the gathering darkness. That's when I noticed it, the silence. The forest had been alive with the sounds of birds, insects, and rustling leaves all day, but now there was an eerie quiet. Even the stream's gentle babbling had ceased. I looked around at my friends, and their faces mirrored my unease. We tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the wilderness, but the unease persisted. The crackling of the fire seemed louder, and the shadows cast by the flames danced ominously. Alex, who had always been the adventurous one, decided to investigate the surrounding area with a flashlight. He returned with a troubled expression, saying he had found nothing out of the ordinary. We dismissed our anxiety as mere jitters from being in such a remote location and decided to turn in for the night. I lay in my sleeping bag inside the tent, unable to shake the sense of foreboding that clung to me. The night was impossibly dark, and the forest seemed to press in on us from all sides. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves and the distant hooting of an owl. Despite the fatigue that had weighed me down earlier, sleep eluded me. Then, I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whisper. It was distant and faint, like the soft murmur of voices carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but the whispers grew clearer and more distinct. I strained to listen, trying to make out the words. They were in a language I couldn't recognize, a haunting and otherworldly chant. My heart began to race, and I realized that the whispers were coming from outside the tent. Panic surged through me as I contemplated waking the others, but a paralyzing fear kept me rooted in place. As the chanting continued, I couldn't help but feel that it was directed at me, as if some unseen presence was trying to communicate with me specifically. It was a sensation of being watched, of being singled out in the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke several times during the night, each time greeted by the same eerie whispers. It was as if the forest itself was alive with an ancient, incomprehensible energy. Morning broke, and the forest seemed to come alive once again with the sounds of nature. The sunlight streamed through the trees, and the oppressive atmosphere of the night lifted. I crawled out of my tent, bleary-eyed and exhausted, to find my friends already awake and packing up. I asked if they had heard the whispers, but they looked at me with confusion. No one else had heard a thing during the night. They assured me it must have been a dream or my imagination running wild. Reluctantly, I agreed, though a nagging doubt lingered in the back of my mind. We decided to press on with our journey deeper into the wilderness. The beauty of the surroundings was undeniable, and I tried to put the events of the previous night out of my mind. We hiked for several hours, following the winding path deeper into the mountains. The terrain grew more challenging, and we had to scramble over rocks and wade through icy streams. The scenery was breathtaking, with rugged peaks rising on all sides, their snow-capped summits glistening in the sunlight. By mid-afternoon, we reached our intended destination, a secluded alpine lake surrounded by towering cliffs. It was a pristine oasis, its waters crystal clear and inviting. We set up camp on the shores of the lake, our spirits lifted by the natural beauty that surrounded us. As evening approached, we decided to explore the area around the lake. Our curiosity led us to a series of peculiar stone cairns arranged in a circle not far from our campsite. The cairns were unlike any we had seen before, each stone had been carefully chosen and placed with precision. Alex, always the adventurous one, suggested we investigate further. We examined the cairns closely, searching for any clues as to their origin or purpose. As we did, I couldn't help but feel that we were intruding on something ancient and sacred. That's when we discovered it, a hidden cave entrance beneath one of the cairns. It was a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The air inside the cave was damp and cool, and the walls glistened with moisture. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to venture inside, though though we left markers to ensure we could find our way back. The cave twisted and turned, its passages narrow and claustrophobic. We used our flashlights to navigate the darkness, the beams revealing strange markings on the walls, symbols and patterns that seemed to date back centuries. As we delved deeper into the cave, the air grew colder, and the sense of foreboding returned. We encountered a chamber filled with stalactites and stalagmites, their formations creating eerie shapes in the dim light. It was as if the cave itself was a living, breathing entity. We were about to turn back when we heard it, the whispers from the previous night. The same haunting chant echoed through the cave, growing louder and more intense with each passing moment. Panic seized us, and we realized we were not alone in the darkness. We turned to leave, but the entrance to the cave had disappeared. It was as if the cave itself had shifted, trapping us inside. The whispers grew closer, and the air was filled with an oppressive energy. I felt as if I were being watched, just as I had the previous night. Then, a figure appeared in the distance, a tall, shadowy figure that seemed to materialize out of the darkness. Its form was indistinct, like a shifting mass of shadows and mist. It moved toward us, its movements unnatural and fluid. Fear coursed through my veins as I stared at the figure, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The whispers grew louder, and the chant took on a sinister tone. It was the same incomprehensible language, but this time, it carried a sense of malevolence and intent. We tried to flee, but the cave seemed to twist and turn, leading us in circles. The figure drew closer, its presence suffocating. I could see its eyes, or what appeared to be eyes, gazing at me from within the shifting shadows. I felt a profound sense of dread, as if I were facing an ancient, primordial force beyond human understanding. It was a presence that existed long before we did, and it would continue to exist long after we were gone. I don't remember how we managed to escape the cave. It's all a blur of fear and confusion. One moment, we were trapped in the darkness, and the next, we were stumbling out into the blinding sunlight. We ran back to our campsite, our hearts pounding with terror. The cairns and the cave were gone, as if they had never existed. We packed up our gear in a frenzy and hiked back to civilization, our minds reeling from the encounter. We never spoke about what had happened in the cave, and the whispers haunted my dreams for weeks afterward. It was a chilling reminder that there are mysteries in the wilderness that defy explanation, forces that exist beyond the boundaries of our understanding. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that we had stumbled upon something ancient and malevolent, an entity that had watched us from the shadows and chose to reveal itself in that dark, hidden place. It was a reminder that the wilderness is not always a place of serenity and beauty, but a realm of darkness and mystery, where the line between the natural and the supernatural blurs, and where ancient forces still hold sway. Camping in the wilderness had always seemed like a romantic adventure, a chance to reconnect with nature and escape the trappings of modern life. But that trip into the Rocky Mountains had shattered my illusions, reminding me that the wilderness is not always a welcoming place. It can be a realm of darkness and mystery, where ancient forces still hold sway, and where the line between the natural and the supernatural blurs. As I reflect on that terrifying camping experience, I'm reminded of the words of John Muir, the famous naturalist and explorer: "The clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness." Perhaps there is truth in those words, for in the heart of the wilderness, we can encounter forces and mysteries that challenge our understanding of the universe itself.